So let me ask you something. Could you be convicted of stealing something that you honestly believed was just abandoned trash? It sounds pretty much impossible, right? Well, a man named Morissette faced that exact charge, all over a pile of scrap metal worth just $84. And his totally bizarre case went all the way to the Supreme Court, forcing them to ask a really fundamental question. When does a simple act actually become a crime? And that's a quote from Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson talking about this very case. What should have been a tiny, insignificant scrap metal deal ended up questioning the very foundation of criminal law in the United States. And it all started with what seems like an honest mistake. So let's dive into the story of this $84 heist. We're gonna set the scene. Our story's about a man named Morissette and what he stumbled upon one day during a hunting trip in rural Michigan that would, believe it or not, change his life forever.
Now, Morissette was no hardened criminal. Far from it. This guy was a World War II vet, honorably discharged. He ran a fruit stand in the summer, and to make ends meet, he collected scrap iron in the winter. Besides a reckless driving charge, his record was clean. He was, by all accounts, just a regular guy with a good name in his community. So one day in 1948, he's out deer hunting, and he wanders onto this government bombing range. But what catches his eye isn't a deer, it's these massive piles of old, spent bomb casings. They're just sitting there, completely exposed, rusting away. Some of them had been there for years. To him, they looked exactly like abandoned junk. So, thinking, hey, maybe I can cover the costs of my hunting trip, he loads up 3 tons of these casings onto his truck. And he's not being sneaky about it. This is happening right out in the open, in broad daylight. He hauls them to a local market, sells them for scrap, and makes a grand total of $84. Well, eventually the authorities show up. Morissette tells them the whole story, right? He explains, look, I honestly thought the casings were abandoned, but the trial court's response was shocking. The judge basically said, I don't care what you thought. You took government property, and that's all that matters. His intent, his state of mind, was deemed completely and totally irrelevant. And that right there brings us to the core puzzle of this whole thing. How can you be guilty of stealing if you never actually intended to steal anything? If you genuinely believe the property was abandoned, are you still a thief? This very question is what sent this tiny $84 case on an incredible journey to the highest court in the land. All right, so to really get how the Supreme Court tackled this, we need to talk about a legal idea that's been around for centuries. It's the principle of the guilty mind, or as it's known in the law, mens rea. You see, in criminal law, almost every crime is made up of 2 parts. First, there's the actus reus. That's Latin for the guilty act. It's the physical component, actually doing the thing. And then there's the mens rea, the guilty mind. That's the mental part, the criminal intent behind the act. For most serious crimes, you've got to have both. And the whole idea behind mens rea is really about blameworthiness. Our legal system just sort of instinctively understands that there is a massive difference between accidentally knocking over a vase and, grabbing it and smashing it on purpose. It's like the classic kid's excuse, but I didn't mean to. Well, in the eyes of the law, that can make all the difference in the world. But, and this is a big but, the law isn't always that simple. As Morissette's first conviction showed us, there's a whole category of crimes out there where your intent is completely irrelevant. The law basically splits crimes into 2 big buckets. In one, you've got your traditional common law crimes, stuff like theft, arson, murder, things we all just know are wrong. For these, the prosecution pretty much always has to prove you had a guilty mind. But in the other bucket, you have what are called public welfare offenses. And you can think of these as modern regulatory rules, where the act alone is enough to be guilty. This is a concept called strict liability. Just think about it for a second. When you get a speeding ticket, does the police officer ask if you intended to speed? Nope, you just did it. Same thing goes for, say, selling contaminated food or putting the wrong label on drugs. The whole point of these laws is to protect the public, so the law puts the burden on you to be careful, no matter what your intent was. And this was the crucial question in Morissette's case. Was taking government property a traditional crime, like theft, which requires intent? Or was it more like a public welfare offense, like speeding? The Supreme Court's answer was crystal clear. Stealing is stealing. It's a classic common law crime, and for that, you absolutely have to prove criminal intent.
Okay, but what's really fascinating here is that intent isn't just a simple on or off switch. The law actually sees it as a spectrum, right? A whole range of blameworthiness, from a pure accident all the way to a deliberate malicious plan. This diagram is a great way to visualize it. Over on the far left, you have strict liability. That's where no mental state is needed at all. But as you move to the right along the spectrum, the level of blameworthiness goes up and up. You move through ideas like negligence and recklessness, all the way to specific intent, where you have a deliberate plan to cause a specific harm, and that's where you're considered the most culpable. So, to make this whole spectrum thing a little bit clearer, modern law has broken it down into 4 distinct levels of culpability. This framework comes from something called the Model Penal Code. Let's just quickly run through these. First up, purposefully. This is your goal. It's your conscious object to cause a certain result. One step down is knowingly. Here, you're not necessarily trying to cause the result, but you are practically certain it's going to happen. Then there's recklessly, which means you see a big risk, you know it's there, but you just ignore it. And finally, you have negligently. This is when you didn't see the risk, but any reasonable person in your shoes absolutely should have. And this flowchart gives us a great visual of that hierarchy. It all flows down from the most blameworthy state of mind at the top, purposefully, to the very least blameworthy at the bottom, negligently. This modern framework is basically a super detailed map of the guilty mind, and it gives courts a really precise tool to figure out just how responsible someone actually is for their actions. So let's circle all the way back to Mr. Morissette and his $84 worth of scrap metal. After all this legal theory, what did it actually mean for him? Well, the Supreme Court unanimously, and I mean unanimously, reversed his conviction. The justices decided that the lower court's instruction, the one saying his intent didn't matter, was a massive, fundamental error. The jury should have been allowed to decide if Morissette truly and honestly believed that property was abandoned. And in his really powerful opinion, Justice Jackson argued that this whole idea of a guilty mind isn't just some passing legal fad. He said it's a core belief in our system of justice, and it's tied to the very idea that we are free individuals who can choose between right and wrong. The prosecution, he said, completely failed to prove Morissette had that vicious will. And that, right there, is the ultimate takeaway. Except for a pretty narrow group of public safety rules, our legal system demands more than just a bad act. It demands a bad mind. To be a criminal, wrongdoing has to be conscious. Your thoughts, your intentions. That's what separates a simple mistake from an actual crime. But this timeless principle is now facing some really mind-bending challenges that the court back in 1952 could never have imagined. So let me leave you with this. If a self-driving car makes an autonomous decision that results in a fatal accident, where is the mens rea? Who has the guilty mind? Is it the owner who's just sitting in the passenger seat? Is it the programmer who wrote the code miles away? The company that built the car? Or is it possible that for the first time we could have a guilty act with no mind to blame at all? That is a question our centuries-old legal system is just now starting to wrestle with.